resurrection of Jesus Christ, if it happened, has to be certainly the central event of history in so many ways.
What Jesus said about resurrection and why it makes sense to doubt or believe on this day of discovery.
According to the Gospel accounts, Jesus offered life after death, a claim many find hard to believe.
I think probably the reason people struggle with resurrection language in the New Testament, resurrection of Jesus in particular, is because they don't see that kind of a world.
I mean, I haven't seen it happen myself, and I'm sure you haven't either.
They've been to a lot of funerals, but they've never seen anybody sit up in the casket.
There is such a naturalistic body of knowledge in our time, in this day, that we don't seem to be, myself included, we don't seem to be as open to supernatural.
Not everyone who hears Jesus' claims automatically embrace them. In fact, some people have terrific doubts about the types of things that Jesus is claiming, especially when they become as grand as, I'm going to sit at the right hand of the Father, or I and the Father are one, or if you see God, you see me. These are not normal claims.
Located less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, on the east slope of the Mount of Olives, the Arab-Palestinian community of Bethany draws visitors from all over the world for a reason. Here, the Bible says Jesus raised a man named Lazarus from the dead. Today, the tomb of Lazarus lies well below ground level. The original entrance is sealed. According to a long-standing local tradition, this is the grave of Lazarus. He had been dead for 4 days. And nobody but Jesus believed that he would ever walk out of this tomb. According to the Gospel of John, Lazarus came back from the dead.
Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Loose him and let him go." The Gospel of John, chapter 11.
Now, realistically, what do we say to those who say, I'm not one of these who are going to visit this tomb? Because I don't have enough faith to believe that anybody can live again after dying, whether we're talking about Lazarus or Jesus or anybody else. Shortly after the reported raising of Lazarus from the dead in Bethany, Jesus made a prediction of his own resurrection. The prediction occurred during his trial before Jewish religious leaders, just a few hours before his crucifixion.
And the prediction was, when that tomb goes empty, I've given you my address. My address is the right hand of the Father, and I share the glory and presence with God. And that means you're accountable not only to the Father, you're also accountable to the Son. Think about that.
Then the high priest said to Jesus, "I demand, in the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus replied, "You have said it. And in the future you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand, and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, "Blasphemy." The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26.
One problem people have with believing in the resurrection is not that they can't believe in the supernatural, but they know that that puts Jesus in a unique place of authority and in a world filled with religions. And that seems intolerant.
Assuming that no one could possibly plan their own death and resurrection, some have suggested that Jesus' death must have resulted from a miscalculation on his part.
Again, some have objected that Jesus really didn't want to die and that his crucifixion was a bad development in his case, kind of accidental. But you have to remember, in Jesus' case, nobody planned his own death more accurately than Jesus did. At least halfway through Jesus' ministry, he started advertising the fact that there would be, at first, the terrible end to his life, apparently terrible end, but that he would rise again. He always provided that comforting clause. Now, to the disciples at first, this seemed like Jesus was probably speaking in tongues of some kind. It really made no sense to them at all. They couldn't conceive of this happening. But this was Jesus' way of saying, no, this is part of the divine design. This is why I came into the world, and this is how it's going to go and how it's going to end.
From that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day. Matthew chapter 16.
At least 3 more times, Jesus gives a prophecy of going to the cross and of being raised from the dead after that.
As a matter of fact, not only Jesus, but this had been predicted 700 years in advance by the prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament, who talked about the suffering servant of God who's going to give his life as a ransom for the people.
This prophecy of Isaiah that many link to Jesus is found in the 53rd chapter of his book. Here the prophet predicts a coming deliverer who would save his people not by conquest, but by suffering and dying for their sin, before his life was mysteriously prolonged.
He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. Yet who of his generation protested? He was assigned a grave with the wicked, though he had done no violence. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life. My righteous servant will justify many.
If these words of Isaiah 53 still stir in us a sense of wonder and curiosity, imagine the mystery that would have surrounded this prophecy in ancient Israel.
Prior to Jesus' entrance into history, nobody could really quite figure out how that could come about. And so Jesus shows them now that as the God-man who would suffer and die for them, and would then be raised from the dead in a declaration that he is victorious, nobody could understand that.
Later, on the night before the crucifixion, the Gospel writer Matthew tells us that Jesus took the occasion of an annual Passover meal to have a Last Supper with his disciples. Once again, he talked about his coming death. This time, however, he anticipated a sacrifice that merged with the story of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. Together with his disciples, Jesus remembered that first Passover, when each family killed a lamb and placed its blood on the doorposts as protection from the death angel. According to Matthew, it was at this table that Jesus linked the cup of Passover to the sacrifice that he was about to offer.
And he took a cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. He gave it to them and said, "Each of you drink from it, for this is my blood, which confirms the new covenant between God and his people. It is poured out as a sacrifice to forgive the sins of many." Matthew chapter 26.
C.S. Lewis is famous for saying, only he's either crazy or he's exactly who he claims to be. Those are the only two options that you have. And so the question is, to someone who's legitimately asking, how could someone even think in those kinds of terms? How's that even possible? What kind of evidence did Jesus give to suggest that this even should be thought about or conceivable as plausible?
Today, people still come here to Al-Lazaria from all over the world to see the traditional site of the raising of Lazarus. Looking back, it's clear that Jesus used this miracle, according to the New Testament, for more than reuniting himself with his dear friend. As Jesus approached Bethany, he told Lazarus' grieving sister Martha that even if a person was dead, he could make him live again. He told her that he himself was the resurrection and the life, which in that moment was probably as difficult to believe as it had been for Jesus' disciples to hear him saying that he had to go to Jerusalem to suffer at the hands of the religious leaders and die and rise again on the third day.
The importance of Jesus' resurrection is this. Jesus was making some very radical claims while he was on earth. He was claiming to be God's uniquely divine Son. He was claiming that he had the authority to forgive our sins. He believed that he was God's agent chosen to usher in our kingdom, and that our eternity was based largely, in fact exclusively, on what we did with him, whether we were willing to buy into his program. Now, when he said these things, his critics asked him for some signs, some evidence that what he was saying is true. And Jesus said, "I'll give you one sign, my resurrection from the dead."
You've got to ask yourself, how'd that tomb end up being empty? And what does that mean? There is something very unusual going on. And it may be that something very unusual is going on because Jesus is a very unusual person.
A reason that people may have a hard time with Jesus as being more than just a man is because there is a theory out there that Jesus, the story of Jesus, is a copy of a pagan myth, that there are other sort of Christs that pre-exist the story of Jesus Christ, such as Osiris or Mithras. And so people might buy into the fact that, hey, this story is no different from the story of Osiris or Mithras.
There are a few potential parallels of dying and rising figures such as gods and heroes in the Greco-Roman world that predates Christianity. However, just because you have those, some similarities with the accounts of Jesus' resurrection, doesn't mean that the latter is fiction.
First of all, when you compare him to a god that was arbitrarily killed or murdered and then goes down into the underworld, and that's where he's renewed as some kind of spirit being that we're not really sure what that means, how does that work out for a person, for their life? What would that do for a person who's a follower of Osiris? I'm not actually sure that it would provide them with any kind of hope like the death and resurrection of Jesus would, because Jesus' death is specifically for providing a way of dealing with sin in a person's life and bringing a person to a place where they're able to come back to God and have a personal relationship with God. There's a goal of reaching out to humans and bringing them back to God. And that's what his death and resurrection entail. And so it gives mankind a hope.
The mere fact that you have similarities between two stories doesn't necessarily mean they're tied in any way. For example, we're all familiar with a ship, a passenger ship that was regarded as unsinkable about 100 years ago. It began with the letter T, the name in it was. It sailed out across the Atlantic about 200 miles on an April night, about 200 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. It hits an iceberg and it sinks. and because it doesn't have adequate lifeboats, more than half of the people on board die. Now, we all know what I'm talking about, right? We're talking about the book, the novel called The Wreck of the Titan, written in 1898, 14 years prior to the sinking of the Titanic. So the fact that you have these very similar details doesn't mean, because this one was a novel, that the latter one wasn't true. We know for a fact it was a true story. It's just that we have some really interesting details that are very similar between the two stories.
The resurrection of Jesus Christ, if it happened, has to be certainly the central event of history in so many ways. If you believe in the resurrection, then you have no trouble believing the rest of the package, that Jesus was both God and man and so on.
When Jesus suffered, he suffered a horrific death. It was utterly humiliating. It was excruciatingly painful. If you think about what was actually done to Jesus, and you had no religious perspective at all, and you thought, God has nothing to do with this, maybe God doesn't even exist, you would probably think this is one of those inexplicable evils. There's just no point. The strange thing is that God himself, through Jesus, has explained the suffering. He's told us the point it serves. He's explained to us that it's not pointless, that it does matter, that it accomplishes a goal. And it turns out that that goal is our good. We who would have thought that there's no purpose served are actually the beneficiaries of the purpose it does serve. And that is the possibility of everlasting life through faith in this resurrected Jesus.
For New Testament professor Mike Wilkins, it took years to move from doubt to belief.
My personal interest in Jesus came about when I was 19 years old. My mother had allowed me to not go to church any longer when I was about 13, and I just didn't see any relevance to it. But at 19, I found myself in Vietnam as a young paratrooper, and that rocked my world. Who am I that I can delight in killing another human being? I just saw such evil in myself. Yeah, I think that wars are necessary at times, but war is horrible, and it brings out the evil in people, regardless whether or not it's a just cause. It takes us to the depth of who we are. And it was while I was there that I had I had the intense desire to see what was real in life. What is true about life? I started looking in a lot of places in philosophy, psychology. I looked in the drug culture of those days. I looked at rock and roll stars as having the answers, and then Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix die. They didn't have any answers. But it was about that time, the late 60s, early 70s, that I ran across some people from the Jesus movement of those days. They were like hippies who had become Christians, and I was struck by the fact that they were so convinced that Jesus was the answer. And so I listened to them, and I spent, probably 6 months with many of them, just talking it through. And I began to read the Bible, read the Gospels in particular. I read each one of them several times. And I began to be convinced that there was something different about this Jesus. But I still wasn't ready to make a commitment to him. And it wasn't until somebody challenged me to look deeply at the historical evidence for the resurrection that my eyes began to open. Because Jesus' resurrection was unique in Jewish history. It was unique in human history. Jesus was unique. And As I looked more deeply into it, as I looked at the evidences for the resurrection in the empty tomb, the witness of women that was not allowed, these many post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, I was struck by this can't all just be one giant hoax. And I came to the conviction, as Paul did, that Jesus' resurrection from the dead was the declaration that he was the Son of God. And that's in Romans 1 through 4. And when I came to that point, I was just blown away. That resurrection affirmation was what convinced me that Jesus was real. And he was who he said he was. I remember in the days prior to my asking Jesus to come into my life and change me, I remember saying to some friends, I said, you know, this is either real or it isn't real. This is all just a game or it's the truth. And if I make a commitment to this, it's all or nothing. What a growth. What a growth from me being this very angry, very strung out, very confused young man, to Jesus. As he took control of my life, he took control of even the little things. My wife would say that I had the foulest mouth of any person that she had ever known. And Jesus just told me very clearly, you don't have to have a foul mouth. And let me help you to speak with purity instead of with filth. In every way, Jesus has continued to address my life, to bring me to the point where I am now. Sure, there were doubts all along the way. I remember once when I was a pastor, I was preparing for an Easter message, and I had the most significant waves of doubt about the reality of all this. Mike, you still just into wishful thinking? Isn't this still just a game? And what it did, and I think that even in some sense God had orchestrated that, is it drove me back to the very basics of who Jesus claimed to be, the basics of the reality of his resurrection. And I went into the pulpit that next day just fired up, gripped by the reality of the resurrection. So it's an ever upward walk with Jesus. In many ways, I used to tell my daughters as I was raising them, you know, girls, you've never been 13 years old before. I've never been the father of a 13-year-old before. I have no clue what I'm doing. But you don't have any clue of what you're doing either. So let's do this together. And that's kind of the way that Jesus says it to me. You've never been here before. Don't feel like you have to know it all. Don't feel like you have to have overcome all of the struggles of your personal life and even your intellectual faith life. I'm here to take you along. It's been a wonderful, wonderful journey.
Now, admittedly, there are a lot of people who are convinced that it takes more faith than reason to believe what Jesus said about resurrection. But we've also heard today thoughtful men and women who are convinced in their minds that the evidence, the converging lines of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is so compelling that it makes faith the most reasonable response. And that, therefore, what happened here in Al-Azariah, the raising of Lazarus, would also then be a preview of what Jesus wants to do for all who believe in him.